Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. My name is Kevin Dunn. I work on the event side of things at the Institute of World Politics. And for those of you who are new, I see a few new faces. Look forward to having you back. Thank you for all those who are returning. We are a graduate school, and we have 5 master's degree programs that basically reflect what we consider the full spectrum of statecraft and foreign affairs here, as well as 16 certificates of study. Today's discussion will be on the record, and I also ask that when we come to the Q&A session, I believe there will be a Q&A session, that you state your name and affiliation, and you wait until the microphone comes to you. That way we can record you. So today's... yes. So today's event should be very interesting. I know for many of you here, we've been closely following the events in Turkey. I know Vilen has much to discuss to this end, and I'm sure we'll all come away with a few things. To that end, I'd love to introduce Vilen Khlgatyan and his professional background. He is also an alum of this school as well. He graduated with a master's in statecraft and national security affairs. And as well, prior to that, he graduated from Webster University for his bachelor's. Mr. Khlgatyan is the founder and president of Global Research Center, the GRC. He specializes in the geopolitics of energy, non-kinetic warfare, the post-Soviet region, and within that, an emphasis on the Caucasus. In addition, he is a principal at the Renovatio Group, a holistic business consulting firm. So I'm sure he will have much to discuss today. I thank him, as does everyone here at the Institute of World Politics, for his time. And without further ado, please welcome Vilen. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I know it's a beautiful day. We've all got other places we could potentially be. So for starters, I just want to mention that this is, as you all are very well aware, an ongoing topic that we're discussing. It's still very fresh, even though it's a few weeks now that the events took place. There's still a number of unanswered questions. New things I'm sure will come to light. And also, I will be going through a few theories or scenarios of who or what was behind the coup. I just want to preface by saying that I'm not necessarily endorsing any of the theories. There is one that I subscribe to a bit more, but we'll get into it. But I just wanted everybody to be aware that we're presenting different perspectives, the popular ones, the dominant ones that are out there right now that individuals both in and out of Turkey are currently discussing and debating amongst themselves. All right. So, multi-pronged analysis, that's basically what I was getting at. We're going to come at it from different angles. I'll also be discussing the domestic situation, the ramifications, the international ramifications, post-coup attempt. These are the numbers. Not going to spend too much time going over this just because I'm sure most of you, if you've been following this topic over the course of the past few weeks, are well aware of them. There's just a graph that I pulled from the BBC that had compiled it, so I have for just a little bit of visual for you all. But the biggest number for me is actually the one that I'll highlight, are the number of military individuals that have been taken into custody. Something like 40% of Turkey's generals are, or a little over 40% of Turkey's generals are under custody. So that's huge. You know, if you could understand or picture in the American context that 40% of our top brass were, taken in, what that would do to our military, both on the moral willpower level, but also just the practical command structure. So I think that's huge, and that's a trend that we all ought to follow as the days and weeks pass, to see whether the Turkish military is able to cope with that drastic change. So, delving right into the scenarios. The first one is that it was a false flag, that Erdogan was behind it, that he staged it in order to consolidate his power, to push through everything that he wanted to get done, but not have to do it through a democratic process. The number one thing that he's been inching for at least a year and a half, 2 years now, is to make Turkey officially a presidential republic, with him obviously the head of a strong presidential system. That's either going to require a referendum or a supermajority in the parliament in order to change the constitution. And that's one of the theories is, or one of the subplots is that was one of the reasons why he or his cohorts would launch a false flag operation. I remember as soon as the news broke on the 15th, a number of blogs and not so much mainstream, but alternative websites, there were a number of individuals that were already jumping on this theory. And again, this is less than 24 hours after the events had happened, but it seemed the timing was just off, and then the fact that as the hours passed, the coup attempt was just so poorly planned, it just seemed to fit a scenario of possibly a coup attempt. A few other reasons that people have brought up are the large-scale purge that we've been seeing. In fact, I believe it was the head of the EU has so many councils, but one of the organs of the EU even said that perhaps this large list of individuals who are being targeted existed prior to the coup. Otherwise, how could they so quickly know whom to go after? And the plane, the Erdogan, the presidential plane, there are reports that an F-16 was trailing it when it was in the air. And why it didn't shoot down the plane or force it to land, again, has been one of the reasons used to suggest that it was part of a false flag attempt by Erdogan and the AKP. And finally, the least, in my opinion, the least likely but still supportive example is that the Ergenekon, which was, if you're not familiar with it, in the mid to late 2010, especially in 2007, there was a drive by the AKP to root out a so-called deep state movement. That was the name that they gave it, the Ergenekon, and it was it was crafted as a deep state conspiracy directed towards the AKP, but also democracy in Turkey. As you're all well aware, Turkey has had several other coups throughout its Republican history. So that's what the AKP and Erdogan claimed was the problem. I'll go into it a little bit more in detail on another slide. But the reason that I say that that's, in my opinion, probably one of the weaker justifications is because they really did do a thorough job of cleaning out the military of Kemalists and any other potential enemies a couple of years ago, starting in 2007. So I'm not as convinced by that, but let's continue. Scenario 2. This is the official version that the Turkish government is putting out, interlaced with the official version that the Turkish street, and by that I mean the public, is buying into and putting out. Again, we're talking about perceptions, and perceptions more often than not don't align with reality all the time. But let's dig into this one. So that's Fethullah Gulen, who I'll be discussing in detail in following slides. But basically, the gist of it is this cleric who resides in Pennsylvania ordered his minions in the Turkish military and other security apparatus to overthrow the elected government, Erdogan. The time had come for whatever reason. Since 2013, Gulen and company have been after Erdogan. That's partially true. I think there's enough evidence at this point to suggest that the audio tapes that were leaked at the end of 2013, revealing Erdogan having some discussions, as well as other individuals, high-ranking individuals such as Ahmet Davutoğlu, the foreign minister at the time, and Erdogan's son was also taped talking about money. They pinned, by they I mean the government was able to pinpoint who was behind that, and they did show enough evidence, I think, to have to link the Gulenists with that as the likely source of those leaks and having taped that conversation. USA unhappy with Erdogan and turned to authoritarian democracy, independent foreign policy. That's another one of the lines that has been thrown out there as a possible reason why the CIA would be involved, why the Gulen movement being used by the CIA or working in tandem with the CIA would be involved. It's because over the years, Erdogan has repeatedly, in his opinion, done what's best for Turkey, or at least his party, going against sometimes the wishes of NATO allies. The earliest and still one of the most vivid examples was in 2003, when the Northern Front was not opened against Iraq, even though the United States asked the Turks to open that front. We know that it would have definitely saved some time and lives, but for domestic reasons, the Turks refused. Another more recent example is Turkey's refusal to actually fight ISIS until very recently with the terrorist attacks at the Ankara airport. Turkey was an open border, and one could even say not quite a breeding ground, but definitely a training ground and a place where ISIS was able to take some refuge before going back into the fight. And it was only until very recently that that border became more secure in terms of allowing ISIS and other jihadis to cross the border back and forth. The other important link with the CIA and Gulen is that in 1999, Gulen fled Turkey, and he was most likely going to be put on trial for trying to overthrow and undermine the Republican system. He got wind of this, came to the United States. In the process, he was having difficulty later on getting a green card and permanent residency, and it was a few names have been floated. The most common that I've seen in articles is a gentleman called Graham Fuller. He's written books on Turkey and the Kurds. One time he was employed with the CIA. He's definitely got an interesting background, but he's an individual, along with a former ambassador to Turkey, a former U.S. ambassador to Turkey, who are very supportive of Mr. Gulen's application. This at a time when the FBI, the newly created Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of State were unsure whether they should actually grant that application or approve it, because they were, again, this was right after 9/11. They were very focused on various Islamic groups. And also in the application, it stated that Mr. Gulen had, the reason he should be given this extraordinary status was because he was a paramount educator, and he would be great to have in the United States as far as his philosophical and educational value. In reality, he's got a fifth grade level education. So the State Department officials, their lawyers rather, were bringing this up and saying, well, this doesn't really match with the records. Regardless, though, he got his application in. He's now residing in Pennsylvania, as I mentioned earlier, and as we'll talk about shortly, the Turks are adamant that he is behind it and he needs to be extradited right away. But of course, America demands proof, which so far the Turks haven't provided, or at least not enough of it. And the last reason, which is kind of a no-brainer, is the CIA has, in fact, had a history of backing coups, the two most prominent being the one in Iran against Mossadegh, and then, of course, later in the 70s when Pinochet came to power. So those are always used as examples. Well, they've done it in the past. What's stopped them from doing it in the present? And then, of course, in the post-Soviet space, the color revolutions have often been linked with the CIA as well, but with not nearly as much evidence as some of the other attempts. And finally, the third scenario. This, I'll just throw it out there now, is the one that I most identify with. I think it was just a last-ditch effort by the remaining faction of Kemalists within the hierarchy of the military to overturn the Islamic tide or Islamist tide that's been ongoing at the highest centers of power within the Republic of Turkey. That photo right there, I'm sure some of you have already seen, is the aftermath of the individuals purportedly involved. I think most of them, but not all, are average soldiers, but there are definitely some officers in there as well. They're stripped naked, beaten. They've been tortured, reports of rape as well. Regardless, though, Akin Öztürk, who was an Air Force commander, Supposedly he was the one that led everything. He says that, if he was not involved, he's being framed. Some other reasons why this scenario, the third scenario, is the likely one, in my opinion, is because the coup attempt, while yes, it was poorly organized, at the same time, I think that the coup organizers, plotters, miscalculated, and they thought that the public would rally to their side, and they didn't realize that at a certain point, the norms now in Turkey have changed, where coup attempts are no longer what they used to be. That even opponents of Mr. Erdogan went out onto the streets, and I think that's very symbolic of the fact that regardless of whether one was AKP supporter or an Islamist of a different variety, they decided that a coup attempt wasn't the way to go. I'd also add that just the process of organizing a false flag operation and ensuring that nothing is leaked, everyone's on board, everyone knows the script, it's rather difficult. And the number of people that were involved to carry this out, just very, very, very difficult. So to me, it's a bit unconvincing. Another reason that I've come across, and surely it's it supports this idea that it was just a last-ditch effort, was August 1st, the military council was supposed to meet apparently twice a year. Turkish military, they have these meetings where officers are either promoted or demoted. The previous years, as I mentioned, many officers have been demoted and encouraged to retire. The reason being that apparently they were part of this deep state, although that was never definitively proven. And I think the generals saw, or the individuals involved in the coup, not just the generals, saw the writing on the wall, and they decided now was the time. But with that said, these are the three dominant scenarios. The first one being, I'm sorry, this one being that it was just it happened. No one planned it in the sense of a conspiracy. It was just the generals, the military involved. And then the second one, obviously, the one that's currently the most dominant theory, particularly in Turkey, was the CIA and the Gulenists. It's also the official theory. And the first one, I don't give as much credence to. But let's continue to who Mr. Gulen is, because he seems to be in every single article that you're coming across on the coup. His name is mentioned at least once or twice. It's always mentioned that he's a preacher, obviously, or was a preacher, a former imam. He's written several books, a number of them on Islam. And he's now become, whether he admits it or not, also a political figure. A lot of individuals involved in politics use his ideas as a motivating factor, if you will. So he teaches a more modern version of Islam based upon another Turkish, Kurdish imam, religious figure, Said Nursi. Said Nursi's writings focused on the confluence of religion and science. He was a big believer in using and he was writing in the early 20th century, Nursi was, big believer in combining the two, big believer in the fact that one doesn't have to be the enemy of the other, and also he emphasized that in order for Turkey to be a strong country, because remember, this is just right after the loss in World War I. It's after Turkey lost a lot of its former colonies, territories, etc. And now, it's what we see with Turkey was, as the Republic of Turkey, is just a small part of what Ottoman Empire used to be. So his emphasis was on, well, one of the reasons we lost was because we technologically were not advanced enough to resist the Europeans. He also, of course, emphasized the ideological aspects as well. But his big thing was, Islam says that right is might. If you're correct, then power is on your side. But he's saying, but we saw that the world doesn't actually work that way. Look at the West, look at the Europeans. They had might on their side, therefore they were right. So he encouraged, and Gulen in turn encourages, a heavy emphasis on the so-called STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. And that's why, which we'll talk about a little bit, but that's why the Gulenist or Gulenist-linked schools are usually in most countries that they're set up in among the top schools, at least when it comes to the hard sciences, because their emphasis comes from this teaching. Their emphasis is so strong on STEM. And in fact, I was talking to a Turkish acquaintance of mine, and she was able to confirm that some of the best schools in Turkey are in fact, or were, they're being closed down, were in fact schools linked with the Hulen movement. So I also mentioned the CIA connection, so we don't need to talk about that, but we will get into the alignment with the AKP, why that was the case, why they broke apart, and what the possible next steps will be in regards to the Turkish request for extradition. But a little bit more on Mr. Hulen. So again, his teachings also reflect Sufism as the third branch of Islam, the other two, of course, being Sunnism and Shiaism. Sufism is often explained very simply as the mystical branch of Islam, and there's a reason why we don't hear about Sufi, terrorists as opposed to the Shia terrorists or Sunni terrorists. They are much more inward-looking in their theology than the other two branches. So his movement is all about serving the Hizmet movement, which I'll talk about in the next slides. But essentially, he encourages Muslims to serve one another, both in their local community and in their extended community, but not just other Muslims, anybody. And that's been one of the appealing aspects of his teaching for a lot of Westerners, is that he puts on a moderate face for Islam, especially for the Western mindset. He's not trying to openly, at least, but there are people that disagree, and again, we'll get into, but openly he's not talking about Sharia. He's not talking about some of the things that in the past 15 years have come to be the negative things that have come to be associated with Islam. So a lot of Westerners, for a number of reasons, have bought into his teachings and genuinely see him as not necessarily as a figure on the level of the Dalai Lama, but as an individual that's very enlightened and is about peace and dialogue and tolerance and all of those buzzwords that we hear so often. Religion and science, mentioned that. Another key thing that he talks about in his writings, a lot of his proponents write in their articles, is how Hulen emphasizes that democracy and Islam can work together, that it's not necessarily one versus the other. I know, which I'll touch upon soon, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a similar organization, although set up slightly differently, their ideology is not necessarily in league with that as far as democracy and Islam being compatible. One's a vehicle towards another goal. But at least in his official writings, Hulen doesn't go in that direction that the Muslim Brotherhood goes in. And the last point, which will be very important later on when I talk about the split between Erdogan and Hulen, is the idea of Islam versus the nation. Islam has a huge emphasis on you're Muslim and that's what matters, not your race, not your sex, and not your ethnic group or tribe or what have you. That will play a role as we go on and learn about the differences between the two men. But again, he emphasizes the Islamic component more than the Turkish component or the any other local ethnic component. So his movement is called Hizmet, and Jamaat are the individuals who are the community, if you will, the followers of it. Hizmet just means service, like I mentioned earlier, just service to your community, service to those around you, service to humankind in general. Began in the 60s. He was already in his 20s when the movement started. Again, on paper, it's just a religious movement, yes, but also it's a social movement. They've got schools and universities, I think, over 180 countries. They've got 130 plus just in the United States. In fact, I think the closest one is in Maryland. They tried to open one up a few years ago in Loudoun County in Virginia. Their paperwork had some stuff that was missing, or I guess didn't meet the standards. Plus, some local community members were a little concerned. But regardless, there exists. These schools exist. They are closer than you may think. But that's not the only thing they've got. Until recently, in Turkey, they had a number of major media publications as well. Today, Zaman, the English version of Zaman, was recently taken over, but that was one of the more popular media outlets. There's also Bank Asia, which is associated with them as well. Now, again, it should be emphasized that Hulen himself doesn't own these things. but people that believe in his teachings, his followers, what have you, they do own them, and the system works that they pay their dues. So many of the attacks against Gulen by Erdogan and his supporters, or just other individuals who are concerned with Gulen's, activities, are that he collects a ton of money from these schools because they're charter schools, so they're not free. You have to pay to go there, and obviously the media empire and the finance empire. There's a lot of money flowing in. We have estimates ranging from 25 to 50 billion in assets that are, again, not necessarily directly under his control, but to a certain extent available for him to tap into, which is obviously a huge amount. I want to emphasize the opposing side, what people say about the movement, which, again, I touched on a little bit, but that it's an effort to get people to buy into a ideology, particularly of Sharia, particularly of political Islam, without them knowing what they're buying into beforehand. And by that, I don't necessarily mean those who have subscribed to that ideology beforehand, but particularly Westerners or others who may not be aware of the deeper connotations of what Mr. Gulen is teaching. But there are also accusations that one of the ways, and this again ties back into the CIA connection, there are also accusations against the Gulen movement that some of their money is made through the Afghan drug trade, that it comes from Afghanistan into Central Asia, where the Gulen movement does have an active presence in Central Asia, with the exception of, I believe, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. They did close the schools down in those two countries. But Kazakhstan has Gulenist schools, Kyrgyzstan. Anyway, that's the route. It makes its way. We're all familiar. Europe is a primary market. Turkey itself is also a transit country for these drugs, not just heroin. But she's I believe Turkish American or Iranian American as well. She's a whistleblower, Sybil Edmonds. She was an FBI translator in the early 2000s. Apparently, the story goes that she came across some translations that talked about CIA or figures within American intelligence working with foreign drug trade, with the Gulen movement involved as well. When she tried to, blow the whistle on this, she was let go. She's been a big proponent of going after the Gulen movement. In fact, not just in regards to this, but their activities in the charter schools as well, which I'll touch upon. But there's a great quote I got from her, which to me symbolized just how complex the situation is. Because on the one hand, we're talking about drugs. On the other hand, we're talking about religion. On the other hand, we're talking about nationalism, coup d'etat. So it's a extremely convoluted situation, but she says you get to a point where it gets very complex, where you have money laundering activities, drug-related activities, and terrorist support activities converging at certain points and becoming one. Now, again, not necessarily endorsing this, but I wanted to highlight that this individual, Fethullah Gulen, has become very polarizing, not just within Turkey and Turkish society, but among other segments, particularly here in the United States. So a little bit more about the organization. They're often compared, as I said, with the Muslim Brotherhood as a model of political activism, Islamic charity work. But again, the difference is that they publicly, again, say that democracy is compatible with Islam, whereas Muslim Brotherhood, not so much. The Muslim Brotherhood, interestingly enough, I was coming across this during my research for this, but during the 50s and 60s, they were accused of working with the CIA by the Egyptian president at the time, Gamal Nasser. As you know, Nasser was a staunch Arab nationalist. He certainly was no friend of the Muslim Brotherhood. And he often accused the Muslim Brotherhood of being or doing the work for the CIA within the borders of Egypt. And that I thought was an interesting parallel between what we're seeing now, which is Erdogan and his supporters accusing Fethullah Gulen of doing the bidding and the will of the CIA within Turkey. And as I mentioned earlier, the charter schools that the Gulen movement runs have been investigated, some of them. There have been trips to Turkey that have been financed, the trips for congressmen and senators to Turkey that have been financed and not reported properly. So that's also been an ongoing investigation. And then workers, particularly non-ethnic Turkish workers at these charter schools have complained of women have complained of sexism. There have also been complaints of if you're not Muslim, you've kind of been left out of some of the meetings and encouraged to, basically not attend. Weren't treated as a full member of the faculty. So according to these complaints, it was because of ethnic and/or religious reasons. And a number of former students and just individuals who have worked there have talked about a cult-like feel to the organization. Now I want to get into the AKP, Erdogan's party, and Hizmet and Gulen. What's the link? Why did they get together, and then ultimately why did they fall apart? So the human capital that Hizmet provided to AKP, I don't think can be understated or overstated. Rather, it's because the AKP came to power. They were an offshoot of an earlier party that had been banned for being overly Muslim. And they really needed to prove that they could in fact govern. But they lacked the know-how in certain key aspects, for example, in the finance ministry, which has now become an issue again, but also in the judicial branch. They made efforts to incorporate non-Kemalist individuals as judges, as lawyers, and this later on proved to be very useful for them in the AKP's drive towards power. But both are neo-Ottomans. I say of different stripes, though. In my research, I came to the conclusion, but again, perhaps when we do Q&A, some of you might have an alternative interpretation. But I came to the conclusion that Gulen is more of a neo-Ottomanist, but he doesn't see it necessarily in ethno-nationalist terms, whereas Erdogan is a neo-Ottomanist. He wants Turkey and Turks to be the head of any new neo-Ottoman project. And I'm not literally talking about the recreation of neo-Ottomanism, but I'm talking about soft power projection. And that ultimately this played a role, was a reason why the two fell apart, was because one has more of an international and a civic idea of Turkishness and what neo-Ottomanism will be, and that's Gulen. Whereas the other one, Erdogan, has increasingly had a more ethno-nationalist vision. The two, as I mentioned earlier, were very interested in cleansing the military of the Kemalist heritage. I'm sure many of you are well aware that the previous coups were carried out, obviously, yes, by the military, but with the idea of preserving the Kemalist and the Republican heritage. So they knew that they couldn't work with the military, that the first target had to be the military, and hence the investigation into the so-called deep state, the Erdogan Khan case that started and really intensified in 2007. Another key thing to remember is when Abdullah Gül was going to run for president, he was going to be, I believe he was going to be the first openly and very proud Muslim president. But regardless, the military on their website, their Ministry of Defense, put out a statement that said that they were concerned about his religious beliefs and everything else. So it was a warning in a little bit, at least that's how the AKP and some other observers took it, to be careful, tread lightly, because we still have the ability to remove you from power should you be going in the direction of Islam. And I think that was the final signal for them that, okay, we can in no circumstances work with the military. They need to be gutted of the Kemalists. And how do they do that? Well, Erdogan, throughout the partnership, not only was he providing state protection to the Gulenists against the Kemalists and the military, but he was putting them into positions of power, particularly the judiciary, which played a huge role because when they would arrest someone, sure enough, the judge and the lawyers would present some kind of case, and the judge would say, yeah, sure, that's enough evidence for us. Guilty, get him out of here. Another important distinction is, or I'm sorry, not distinction, but another important element that later came into play was the fact that the Gulenists were setting up schools, as I mentioned, since the 90s, particularly when the Soviet Union collapsed. They moved into Azerbaijan, the Islamic regions of Russia, and also Central Asia, and set up a lot of schools there and media outlets. And that was the AKP made overtures to these states. So that was beneficial for the AKP and for Turkish foreign policy as well, is to have these schools and the soft power and the pro-Turkish sentiment that the local population felt, thanks in part to the creation and operation of these schools. Why did they split? So, as I mentioned earlier, the idea that Gulen subscribes to, and that his, for lack of a better word, his guru, his teacher, also subscribed to, is this idea within Islam that right is might. And I think the split took place because Gulen came to see that Erdogan provided everything that he could for the Hizmet movement and for Gulen, and now it was time to move on to the next level. Erdogan is a corrupt politician. I think the leaked tapes in 2013 already proved that. The fact that ISIS oil has been trafficked and sold in Turkey, and the Turkish authorities have turned a blind eye, I think has been a more recent example of that. But regardless, the point is that Erdogan was no angel. Gulen knew this, and Gulen, whether he's perfect or imperfect, the point is he genuinely, I think, wants to cleanse the Turkish government of what he sees as injustice. What can make a great case that he's partially responsible for the injustices taking place, but that's what I read from my analysis of his teachings, his writings, particularly an early book, one of his earlier books on the Prophet Muhammad. There's a section there where he delves into this Islamic concept of justice, injustice, of right being might, not the other way around. And that stood out to me, and particularly then when they targeted in 2013 the corruption of the AKP, or the alleged corruption of the AKP. I was connecting the dots there, that perhaps there's more to that than just finding something quickly to get rid of Erdogan. This is huge. This, if you can read it, go ahead. I'll read portions of it. But the reason why I say it's huge is because it partially, or in great deal, explains why the coup, another big reason why the coup, this recent coup attempt, was not successful. So Turkey has over 85,000 active mosques, and this is from 2009, by the way. Turkey has over 85,000 active mosques, one for every 350 citizens, compared to one hospital for every 60,000 citizens. The highest number per capita in the world, and with 90,000 imams, more imams than doctors or teachers. The rest you can see is just talking about the different figures and how much the religious movement has grown. But the other one at the bottom that I want to point out is that, where was it? There we go. The Friday prayer attendance rate in Turkey's mosques exceeds that of Iran's. Now, if these figures are true, and it comes from a reliable source, Middle East Quarterly, think about that. We have a republic that on paper is secular versus a republic on paper which is theocratic, and the attendance rate for mosques is higher in the secular country than in the officially theocratic country. All right, getting into what does this mean, right? We talked about the coup, we talked about some of the ideology. What does it all mean? I think in the domestic context, Erdogan will continue to increase not only his power base, but the actual power available to him, the drive towards the strong presidency that I mentioned earlier. That's not going to stop. Now he has even more reason to go forward with it. And no one's really standing in his way at this point. Military and intel, they've already said they're going to bring that under civilian control. Frankly, I mean, I think that's probably a good development. It should have been under civilian control to begin with. That partially would have helped to prevent at least some of the coup attempts. But regardless, that they're already pushing forward with, and that's going to be a substantial change for obvious reasons. Limits on independent press and the court system. Well, as I already mentioned, they took over hooliganist-linked media outlets. They've harassed journalists that before the coup attempt were reporting on the situation in the southeast of the country, the insurgency, or what the Turkish government names the terrorist activities in southeast Turkey, the operation there. So that's not going away, especially now, and it's got even more of a mandate to go after journalists. And Kurds will be further marginalized, even though the main Kurdish party, the HDP, came out and obviously was against the coup attempt, and they said they support the AKP in its attempt to get to the bottom of this. I don't think that we're going to see particularly not anytime soon, the betterment of the relations between Turks and Kurds, particularly on the government level, between the AKP and the HDP. So that's something to watch for. Unfortunately, in the media, when they have been talking about Turkey the past couple of weeks, for understandable reasons, it's been about the coup attempt. But I don't want anyone to think that the operations ongoing in the southeast have stopped. Interestingly enough, the second army of the Turkish military had its head, the head of that unit, of that army. He was one of the people that was implicated in this recent coup attempt. So he's been removed. And it's the second army, which is actually fighting the Kurds currently. So, as I mentioned earlier, the 40% of Turkey's generals being arrested and or investigated, how is that going to affect the military? We'll be able to see that in the southeast, assuming some news is able to come out. This one for me is the most interesting, and it's the one that obviously will impact Americans the most, the international ramifications. We can delve into this a bit more during the Q&A, which I'm trying to get to because, again, I'm just as interested to hear what you all have to say as well and what your thoughts are. But I do believe that the relations with the EU, the Turkish relations with the EU are pretty much done, especially if Turkey brings back the death penalty, which they very well might. I don't see the EU honoring its agreement with the Turks regarding the refugee situation. I don't see the Turks doing anything to honor their agreement with the Europeans. They certainly, even before the coup, they weren't meeting the requirements that the Europeans, that the EU had asked for. I think the relations with the U.S. will be strained as well. I don't see the United States extraditing Gulen. I think it would send a very bad signal that anytime a country, but even an ally, demands something of us and they don't provide the adequate proof or whatever we require, that we just give in. I don't think that's a signal that the U.S. that the Obama administration or even their successor, regardless of whether it's Trump or Clinton, will want to send. So I don't see it breaking the relationship, because I think there's more to it than just this, but definitely putting under strain the relations with the Turks. Interestingly enough, this morning's New York Times had an article about one thing that's uniting all Turks is the idea that the United States was either behind or encouraged or is okay with the coup attempt, because the logic is, well, he lives in your country, we say he did it, you're still harboring him, you're asking for this, that, and the other, why won't you just send it to him? And the analogy that the article said that they're making is, 9/11 happens, Osama bin Laden, let's say, was living in Turkey, the United States asks Turks to extradite him, and the Turks don't. Again, we're talking about perceptions, not necessarily reality, but it's important to realize that the level of anti-Americanism in Turkey has generally been high, particularly in recent years. It's very high now, and it's not going to go down anytime soon, short of Gulen being extradited, which, again, I don't see happening. Another trend to follow is the relations between Ankara and their big neighbors, the Russians and the Iranians. August 9th, Erdogan will be in St. Petersburg. He'll be meeting with President Putin. Officially on the agenda, a few things have been released. It's going to be about energy. If you remember, until the Turkish warplane shot down the Russian plane in November of last year, there was a pipeline that was going to be built. Turkstream was the name that had been given to it, under the Black Sea into Turkey, and then it would stop at the border with Greece. That obviously was shelved after the plane was brought down and relations went to all-time low. But now there's talk about bringing that back. Gazprom has already had meetings with their corresponding officials on the other side. There's also a nuclear power plant that Russia was helping to construct, or at least was going to construct. That was put on hold. Now the likelihood of that coming back online also has gone up. And Iran's big issue with Turkey in recent years has been its Turkey's support for the various jihadi groups in Syria, and obviously Iran's support for Assad. I think we'll see, particularly if Turkey is serious about its rapprochement with Russia, we'll see Turkey no longer backing any factions that are against Assad. That doesn't mean that they'll be supporting Assad, but I think if the Russians will probably demand that of the Turks, if they truly want to normalize ties, that you got to stop allowing the free flow of fighters into your country. Again, whether they agree or not, I don't know, but I don't see the Russians not having that as a precondition. An obvious one, riskier place for businesses, not just for Western businesses, but Western businesses tend to be even more risk-averse than some of their other counterparts. So that will only negatively impact the Turkish economy, so I guess you could put that under domestic context as well. I do foresee in the medium to long term, by medium I mean the next 5 to 10 years, and long term, anything beyond that, Turkey eventually, and this is with the caveat that Erdogan remains in power and his ideology and the AKP remains in power. So if it doesn't, then forget what I'm saying. But assuming he and his ideology and his party stay in power, I do foresee Turkey moving more and more to the east. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to join some Eastern NATO-like alliance. No, but I do foresee them as seeing the writing on the wall. I think the EU is in serious trouble, and at this point, I don't know, why they even would want to join the EU. And frankly, they don't want to join the EU. That's usually used to get money out of the Europeans. I do see them being in NATO, but again, we've got at least one candidate in this country talking about, NATO and its usefulness and whatnot. So that'll be a ongoing topic. A major Muslim country that they've had bad relations with, basically since the Muslim Brotherhood was ousted a couple of years ago, is Egypt. You'll see a further deterioration in Turkey's ties with Egypt. A few days ago, the Egyptian parliament decided that, or was petitioned to put up a vote to recognize the Armenian genocide. That's not just for humanitarian reasons, it's for political reasons as well. I think the Egyptians would love to kind of, stick it to Turkey by recognizing it. And I think if I'm not mistaken, if Egypt recognizes the Armenian genocide, it'll be the second Muslim majority country after Lebanon to do so. And pressure countries to close Gulen-linked outlets. We are already seeing that, both in this country, but more heavily in the Balkans, Albania and Macedonia, as well as Kosovo and Bosnia. They have Gulen-linked schools. They've already been contacted by the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs to investigate certain teachers and principals, and it doesn't take much to imagine that the next request will be to close down the schools. We saw a similar situation also on the other side of the world in Kazakhstan. They've also been contacted by Turkish counterparts in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to investigate the Gulen schools that are operating in Kazakhstan. So the cash cow that may or may not be the Gulen school system might be in serious trouble. But with that said, I'm going to wrap up. I want to do a Q&A. Just please, as Kevin said, state your name, wait for the microphone to come. If you've got statements to make, that's fine. Just make it concise, and we'll go from there. But questions are also appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, two things. You mentioned EU and briefly NATO, but what's the status of the nuclear base there, the U.S. Supported or staffed?
In Incirlik?
Yes.
Yeah.
And with the 50 hydrogen bombs, who's in charge of them? Are they in any danger, or were they during this attempted takeover?
Right.
And secondly, on your last point, is there any projection that the Gulen-type schools in Turkey will ever reopen?
All right, thank you for those two questions. I'll start with the second one first. Again, if the AKP stays in power short of something happening and there's a rapprochement between the Gulenists, the Hizmet movement, and Erdogan, probably not. I mean, why would they open those schools back up? If anything, if they were smart, they should keep the structure of the schools as far as the emphasis on STEM and just get rid of some of the Islamic or Islamist ideology, or at least include that, but in a way that's beneficial to the AKP. So they might do that, but as of right now, I haven't seen anything about that. Your second point, Turkey has gone out of its way a couple of times to emphasize that the base, in private, and a little bit in public too, but to emphasize that they're not going to close the base, they're not going to ask the U.S. to leave, and that the nukes were secure. I was told that special forces were on the scene, particularly for that reason, during the night or morning of the coup. Turkish special forces. And a high-level delegation, American military delegation, was recently in Ankara, and they were told that not to worry, the base is still operational and will be. And I believe as a week or two ago, they've been flying from Incirlik to conduct missions. So I think it seems as if it's back to normal.
My name's Keith. Thank you very much for your talk. My question is about the ramifications for the counter-ISIL campaign. Maybe you could talk about flights from Incirlik, foreign fighter movement over the border, anything having to do with the counter-ISIL campaign.
Okay, so I should have added to the previous question that the U.S. does have other options if Incirlik closes. I mean, we've obviously got carrier warships that could be used. Got bases in Italy. Jordan can be used. Even some of the Gulf states can be used. True, they're further away, but nothing major. So that's important to keep in mind, that if Incirlik, for whatever reason, is unavailable to us, whether because Turks eject us from there or something else happens and we just can't use it, it's not a huge problem. Counter-ISIL campaign. Again, it goes back to, and were you asking on the American side or the Turkish side of that campaign? Both. Well, the American side is ongoing. The Turkish side, again, we just have to watch what's the status of the military. I mean, the Turkish military has a very proud history, and they overnight, one could say, but as I mentioned, it really started earlier. At least 5-6 years ago, they've been gutted, and now 40% of the generals are no longer there. Other mid-level officials, officers are no longer there, under investigation. I think their bigger priority now isn't so much outside of Turkey, but containing the insurgency in southeast Turkey, and also going after Erdogan's real and or perceived enemies. I think that's their focus. The counter-ISIL campaign, being realistic about it, Turkey was never a big part of that. Like I mentioned earlier, if anything, it was only until the bombing at Ataturk Airport that ISIL all of a sudden became a major enemy for them as well.
Elaine Soreo, Associate Rector of WIUU in Ukraine. you've created so many links here that it's absolutely amazing. I'm particularly interested because, well, it's my 30th wedding anniversary, and we just lost out on our trip to Istanbul. So, we're going to Venice instead. Anyway.
It's a nice alternative.
Yeah. But I was really looking forward to another trip to Istanbul. So, anyway, you raised a point at the very end, the connection with Russia, and how things had totally soured before, back in November with the down plane, and of course, giving the state of energy and Russia with the Gazprom, and now the energy, the pipeline probably back on. At the same time, the nuclear issues of our sites in Turkey, and at the same time, what's going on in Crimea with the Russians having moved nuclear weaponry into Crimea. And then, of course, with Turkey being the Bosporus, the entrance to the Black Sea, and trying to make sure that NATO doesn't get into the Black Sea. So to throw a sort of another stone in the stone soup, is scenario number 4 possibly that this is that maybe there was a Russian hand in this whole attempted coup?
So to use a phrase that one of my favorite professors here used, suspend the disbelief, right? And it could be. I mean, if there evidence comes out or enough evidence comes out, sure. I mean, I'm open to a lot of different possibilities. I personally, at this point, haven't seen enough to think that the Russians would be involved. I think they've got their hands full as it is. Ironically, or not ironically, but oddly, one could even say that if we're going to link Russia into this, and going back to the second scenario of the CIA possibly being involved, not long before the coup attempt on the 15th, Turkey started making overtures to the Russians. That I didn't list that on there, but one of the arguments that I saw for why the West would want a coup to be successful and or be involved in it is because they don't want a rapprochement between Russia and Turkey. So again, I'm open to different interpretations. I read a blog post, I don't remember where, but it was hinting at the scenario that you just outlined. I wasn't convinced by it, but that's why, and not too many people are talking about it. That's why I didn't bother putting it up on the slide. But at this point, again, there's so many unanswered questions. I'm open to other possibilities. I just, like I said, I identify more with the third scenario where it was a coup attempt. I don't think it was Gulen calling on a cell phone directing it, but he might have had a small part to play in it. But I genuinely believe it was individuals in the military that were the last remnants of the Kemalist and Republican ideology who wanted an end, or at least to put an end to the Islamic trajectory that Erdogan is on.
Hi, Matt from Middle East Institute. My question, and it plays right into how you wrap that up, is what the leading theory, the leading accepted theory seems to be that it was Golan orchestrated or at least inspired. So my question is, why do you think that the Kemalists were so much involved?
Because I'm just as curious as probably the U.S. government, if they already haven't received it, to see as, I mean, I'm not expecting Gulen standing there with a transcript and a cell phone and like, this is the day and this is the time. Like, that's not the evidence I'm looking for. But the U.S. has asked for concrete evidence. Maybe they've already submitted it and it's not in the media yet. But it's a lot of speculation, and it's just too convenient to pin it on Gulen, in my opinion, when he is already Erdogan's number one enemy. I think the statement that this was a gift from Allah, You can read as much as you want into it, but when Erdogan said that, to me, I think first and foremost he meant it's a gift because now he can go after the individuals that he had been seeking to go after for a couple of years. That list that they have was probably, organized from a couple of years ago already, and it was ready to go. I just don't see. Again, I'm not saying that it's not possible. It very well could be. I just want to see a bit more evidence before I just accept what the Turkish government is saying because, it's in their interest to pin it on Gulen. Whereas the Kemalist aspect, that to me that makes more sense. That there's still a remnant that was upset in the direction that Turkey was going into. They very well may have been encouraged to go off the ledge by the Gulenists, but to say that it was Gulen directing it from Pennsylvania or people high up in his organization, I'm just waiting to see a bit more of that before I, go with it. But, I'm not, by no means am I saying it's unlikely. Armin?
Thank you. Armin Sahakian with the Eurasian Research and Analysis Institute. Firstly, thank you for the very informative talk. My question is regarding Turkey-NATO relations moving forward. You sort of touched upon it, but I'm curious if you can elaborate on it a bit more, considering that Turkey is the second largest army in the alliance and I guess the largest on the European continent by virtue of US, of course, being the largest. And then on the other hand, you having Turkey having a rapprochement with Russia and trying to get closer ties, certainly a conflict that you alluded to earlier. So on the one hand, it's a liability for NATO to let it loose, right? I mean, Secretary Kerry made a statement about Turkey possibly being kicked out of NATO, right? But then on the other hand, it's also a liability to keep it if it continues on the trend of getting closer with Russia. So how do you see this dilemma being solved in terms of Turkey staying within or without NATO? Thanks.
So, great question. I emphasize to people when I talk about the current relations between Turkey and the West, particularly the United States, the problem for the West is not and has not been Turkey. It's Erdogan and what he stands for or doesn't stand for. That's the problem. That's why I don't think it's such a leap to say that if the coup had been successful, similar to how the United States eventually ended up accepting, the overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, that the United States would have, and the West in general, would have been okay with a new regime in power, particularly if it was, secular. Maybe not, but I don't think we would have cried over Erdogan being replaced. I don't think that, like I said, the U.S. relationship with Turkey, I don't think this is going to break it, but it's only going to add to a strained relationship. I don't think Turks are going to leave NATO. What I do possibly see happening, and there are two things, is Turkey inching closer to joining if they do make that pivot to the east, which I think, like I said, if Erdogan stays in power, they will. I see them eventually trying to join the Eurasian Economic Union, which was set up by Russia 2 years ago. I think that would actually make more sense for them than the European Union at this point. So we'll see. The August 9th meeting, pay attention to what comes out of that. The other thing that I said I would tie into in regards to NATO and the trajectory is, if you remember, I think it was last year, Turkey was going to buy missiles or anti-missile defense system from the Chinese, and they were very adamant that that's what they were going to go with. And finally, they were pressured into not buying the Chinese system because, for obvious reasons, both technical, integrating into the NATO and Western system, but also the possibility that there might be software on there that is then able to get into the NATO system, and the Chinese could use that. Regardless, at the last minute, the Turks decided, all right, fine, we're not gonna go with the Chinese system. We'll buy a Western system. I don't think you'll see August 9th any talk of Russian armament supplies to Turkey. But if down the line, let's say in the next year, 2, 3 years, if you start seeing the arms trade between the two countries, particularly obviously Russia selling to the Turks, I think that's an indicator that the Turks have already kind of started to make up their mind and what trajectory they want to take their state to. But again, looking at this from a civilizational and just a very big picture point. I do believe that the Turks see Europe is on the outs. They're not going to recover anytime soon, and I don't see a reason why they would want to get on the European bandwagon at this point when, the East presents an alternative that will require less of them on the democracy side, less of them on the human rights side, and actually might fit better into a potential model that Erdogan might try to follow economically. Because I mentioned the finance ministry, let me touch on that a little bit too. Erdogan has been wanting to borrow money, but international investors, people who would buy the bonds, don't want to pay, or if they're going to lend money, they want higher interest rates. It's like 4%, 5% right now. Erdogan's adamant that that's the correct level. He thinks that there's also some attempt in the Ministry of Finance to thwart him. So with that said, I think you'll see an economic model perhaps take hold in Turkey that it's closer to what's been dubbed as state capitalism. And all these things, if you tie them in together, it'll be you can paint a picture of what the future may hold for the Turks.
Hi, I'm Katie Preston, also from the Middle East Institute. So given the offensive going on in Aleppo right now, there have been competing interpretations of how much Jaish al-Fatah and the other armed groups are receiving active support from Turkey in the past or now. So given that, you mentioned that you think that Russia and Iran are going to put Turkey's support for the opposition in jeopardy. I would love to hear more about both the short term, what Turkey is doing right now, and also where along the lines you think Turkey is going to change that stance.
Well, I'll talk just very briefly on the subject because Syria, I've been following it, but it hasn't been a country I've studied in depth. So I don't want to say things that are either untrue or I'm unaware of. But again, in the short term, I haven't seen much in the media or in general from public officials, Turkish public officials, talking about the Syria front as much. I think the focus has been on the domestic situation. So, I can't really talk to that. Long term, though, I can offer what I said earlier, which is if Turkey is serious about restoring ties with Russia and Iran, they will have to stop their support of the Free Syrian Army or any of these other groups that are opposed to Assad. And for years, obviously, Erdogan was one of the first foreign leaders, particularly I think the first one in the region to just come out against Assad right away. He did kind of a 180 because just a few years earlier, he's very close with the Lebanese, very close with the Syrians. But regardless, I do think that we will see Turkey place more of an emphasis on restoring its broken ties with the Russians than on going along with the West's objectives in Syria, because economically speaking, they've lost out a lot because of Russian tourists not being allowed to travel to Turkey. We're talking in the billions. I saw a figure that was saying if it were to continue, it could be like 10, 12, 13 billion dollars, something like that, very high. And you have to remember that Turkey's economy is very reliant on tourism. It was one of the strong, and even still is one of the stronger sectors of the Turkish economy. So I think their relationship with Russia, or restoring it rather, is more important than at this point having Assad replaced with someone else. Particularly when we're seeing that the West isn't even sure whether that's what they want anymore, at least in the short term. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My name's Ann Vroom. I'm wondering, what does this event say about our U.S. statecraft? Do you think we knew about it and did nothing, or it was a complete surprise and we were caught flat-footed and then recovered? I know that the president made a statement about everyone in Turkey should support the democratically elected entities. It just really seems like such an enormous event in a region that we're supposedly well versed with regard, that I'm just wondering what your take is about what we were doing here. while it was going on?
Well, I'm not privy to the intelligence community and their, what they know or don't know. I would suspect that we probably caught wind of it not too long after the Turks caught wind of it, because you have to remember that after the coup happened, I think a week after, or maybe a little less, it was revealed that the main Turkish intelligence agency, the MIT, warned Erdogan and company that, hey, something's coming. They met an hour after the warning, and apparently some security people were dispatched to round up these generals that would be involved in an alleged coup. And then when these generals caught wind that something was coming on, they launched the coup, and that's why it was so haphazard. I would be surprised, because the United States still has the best signals intelligence capabilities in the world. I read an article, I think it was in The Guardian, that said that some of these hoolenists or pro-hoolenists or just people opposed to Erdogan were using a messaging app that had very simple security on the app. No, it wasn't WhatsApp. It was a different one. If you go on The Guardian and type like Turkey coup messaging app, it'll come up. But it definitely wasn't WhatsApp. Regardless, it's similar to WhatsApp though. It was a example of the article was saying that even though the coup happened months after the Turks broke this and the people that were using it realized that it wasn't secure, that stuff like groups that were opposed to Erdogan were likely being monitored. So I think we've definitely got the same capability and then some. I would assume we were aware, but I don't know. As for our statecraft, I mean that region right now is just such a mess. I've from day one. I mean, I'll say it right now. I don't mind, but I've been opposed to what the West has been doing in Syria. I think we've helped create a much bigger mess, but that's a different issue. I would just add that we need to keep an eye on what they decide to do in regards to the extradition of Gulen, because that's damned if you do and damned if you don't. Because on the one hand, the United States has an independent judiciary, and we do require evidence to be presented to us, and then independently of the executive, we as in the judge makes the decision, guilty, not guilty, and then whatever the punishment is. Or that's not necessarily the same in Turkey. And how do we convey that to them? And not only convey that to them, but let them know that it was an impartial decision. By luck, yeah. Thank you. Let's do two if you don't mind. Yeah, let's do two. Sir, right there.
Here. Thank you very much. Herbert Regenbogen, Touro Law Center. Identity and post-nationalism. The question in that framework is wealth accumulation. And how can that wealth accumulation continue for Erdogan to remain in power when the scenarios you related to in this discussion is that they are, as a country, moving eastward? Mm-hmm. When the per capita income is by no imagination close to that what the West represents.
I would add that I don't disagree with you. I would add that we need to look at Erdogan not as one of us in the sense of mirror imaging, but as somebody who's got his own agenda. For him, based on what we're seeing, it's been about power accumulation. Of course, money's a big part of that. And one of the countries that he's had sometimes bad, well, not bad, but tense, sometimes good relations with has been China. China, we've seen, has been willing to partially, for example, help the Russians in the current bind that they're in economically and financially speaking. If they're willing to do that for the Russians for obvious geopolitical reasons and also economic, I don't see why they wouldn't be inclined to possibly do the same for the Turks. And also, I should add, or rather clarify, that when I see them going to the east, it doesn't necessarily mean abandoning everything from the west. It doesn't mean, well, we're no longer going to trade with the west. So I apologize if I came across as presenting it as a binary, either or, but it can be both. Now, would the West be willing to entertain that? Maybe, maybe not. But I can tell you that it would be a big coup, and no pun intended, if Russia, Iran, maybe China were able to pull the Turks away, and the Turks willingly go even bigger. How we're going to see that is the first inclination will be what comes out of the meeting between Putin and Erdogan in a couple of days. Pay attention, August 9th. I don't think much will be revealed, but what steps are taken after that? Politicians say a lot of things, but what are the concrete actions? So I could very well be proven wrong, but I do see Erdogan staying in power, and as I said, if he stays in power, I do see him drifting away from the West.
Oh, did you have another
Well,
question?
I was going to ask one.
Is this the last one?
I guess. I
Okay.
think so.
All right.
Okay, Tony Drexler, international health consultant. You mentioned the Kurds and the activities of the Second Army in eastern Turkey. I wonder if you'd speculate on the Syrian Kurds and on Turkish activities to restrict the Syrian Kurdish advances along the border and the support they're receiving.
Yeah, would just comment on that. We need to be aware of where Turkey is going after the coup domestically, because that'll dictate its foreign policy. I don't think the Kurdish issue is going to go, as I mentioned, and I think it was the last slide, that the Kurdish issue is somehow going to get better. Erdogan has been opposed to Kurdish autonomy, to many Kurdish rights, and obviously definitely opposed to Kurdish independence. The closest the Kurds have, well, they've got northern Iraq, but to being independent is that little sliver of land that they've got in northern Syria, right on the border with Turkey. Even with all the troubles that are going on in Turkey, I think the Turks would go to nearly any extreme to prevent the establishment of an independent Kurdistan. I don't think that we'll see that happen necessarily, not yet, because the West doesn't fully support it. The Iranians definitely don't support it, and Russia's not going to get involved. So without any major world power, or at least even a regional power, to back them, the only country in the region that I think might be favorable to seeing an independent Kurdistan is Israel. But Israel is also having a rapprochement with Turkey, so are they willing to throw that down to create an independent Kurdistan? So, in regards to this, the Syrian Kurds, they've been obviously a big help to the Western effort to fight ISIS. They've got arguably the best local fighting force short of the Syrian Arab Army. I think they'll continue to be a reliable ally for the West, but if they continue to make overtures towards independence, Turkey will probably have no choice but to interfere. And if the Turks think that the United States and/or the West is directly involved, that would just be one more reason to further raise the tensions between the two states. All right, that's it? We're done? All right, well, they're kicking us out. Thank you, everyone, for coming.